So yeah, as Sarah was saying, I am a business psychologist, but I actually started as a counseling psychologist, and then I moved into business because I say counseling got a bit more tiring. This is more fun, but it's very much the same behavioral science we use. And in fact, what we're going to cover today, I'll put on the slides in a second. Make your emotions your superpower. It's all around emotional intelligence. Now, what is that? Well, let me give you a little backdrop to this, which is positive psychology. Now, if I was in a room with you, I would ask you, have you heard of positive psychology? And most people will think straight away, is that positive thinking? Well, it's a little bit different, okay? Because positive thinking could be an outcome of practicing positive psychology. But positive psychology is actually a rigorous science behind optimal functioning. Up until the mid-80s, all psychology was looking at negative emotions, what got in your way. In fact, how you're making your emotions not allow you to be a superpower. So those emotions were, if you're working with a psychologist up until the 80s, they would be looking at what gets in your way, why does your life lack meaning, what are your deficits, what are your barriers? And the thinking then was, if you really understood all the issues in your life, you'd be able to flourish. Now, a big shift in psychology came in the mid-80s when they started to look at, you know what, we've never studied the science behind what has people functioning at their optimal level. What makes you want to get up in the morning? What would make your life more meaningful? What would make a team more effective? And it's the science behind that, which is positive psychology. Now, the reason I explained that to you is because emotional intelligence, which we'll be looking at together today, it's one of the key components of positive psychology. But it's not just happy thoughts, because let's be honest, if you're not feeling great and somebody says to you, just think positively, that's actually not very helpful. It's quite irritating, isn't it? And now a lot of this comes up, you know, those kind of self-help books, which are kind of popular psychology. Now, as psychologists, we poo-poo them mainly because we're jealous of their sales, but a lot of them aren't based on any research. They're just a catchy title and an idea that somebody comes up with creatively, but it's not necessarily going to last or stick. In fact, it's about January, people start buying them, and it's a big business. Do you remember we used to travel, or allowed to travel to America again? But in the bookshops and the airports, the best sellers are always those self-help books and cookery books. Now, what happens is you buy them, and especially in January, they flourish in sales, and you kind of read them and you go, that's it, I'm going to change my life. But after a few weeks of pretending to be somebody else, most of us say, I'm going back to being myself. Now, the difference in what I'm going to look at with you now, it's not trying to create a new, different you. It's actually trying to stretch your world. It's trying to tap into what you do to do more of it, rather than you're pretending to be somebody else, as if that's possible. And that's why those books, you could get lucky. There could be a positive coincidence, but more than likely, you feel like you're not being authentic. So I know you've looked at leadership, etc., and authenticity. So this isn't about changing yourself at all. Positive psychology is about using yourself more and being more enthusiastic about who you are. Everybody always wants to change themselves, who they are. You can't actually do that. However, you can become more enthusiastic about who you are. So feel free to jump in with questions. That's where the real learning happens. Well, it's also good fun for me. I'm going to throw up the slides now, but I'm very happy to, because I know we all get the Zoom fatigue, which I'll be looking at with you shortly as well. So here we go. What are we going to look at together? As Sarah was saying, you'd also have these slides, so don't worry too much. Scribble notes if you like. So we're going to look at how to make your emotions your superpower, and the key component of positive psychology being emotional intelligence. Now, this is what business psychologists do, okay? I lecture on this as well. You might be familiar with business psychology. Really, it's just how to help people transform their experience of work for the better. Now, this is really interesting because most people are always trying to change other people, aren't they? But you can't actually do that. It's impossible to change somebody else unless they want to be involved in that change. And this is where you get leaders. Leaders get very frustrated at their people because they're not doing what they want them to do. And then rather than thinking it's something I'm doing as a leader, how I'm communicating, I blame the people, don't I? I kind of say, oh, people, they're just resistant to change. Well, people generally aren't resistant to change. They just happen not to respond very well to forced change. But if they can be meaningfully involved in it, they'll champion it with you. And this is left over from the likes of Freud, and remember the psychoanalytical work, where if you were late for one of his sessions, he would say that you're resistant. Or if you didn't like one of the ideas he came up with for you, he'd say you're in denial. Now, modern day thinking is actually, they're not even useful concepts, but there's no science behind them either. That doesn't stop leaders often using them, going, they're in denial, they're just resistant. Generally, when I hear that, I think of people just aren't bought in. Now, as leaders, as people who work with others, we're always trying to change other things, aren't we, or other people. But as I was saying, it's actually not possible to do unless the person is willing to do it. People get married on the premise of, sure, I'll change him in a couple of years. Now, we love it because we get a lot of couple counseling work out of it, but it's unlikely to happen, okay, unless the person wants to change. So you'll see that this is quite clever in how we work. We're not looking to transform the organization or even the context, but we're transforming our experience of it, because that's the bit we've got control over. We can manage our emotions and have a different experience. We can choose how we respond in situations, but not within the context potentially of our choosing. And if you think of COVID, that's a perfect example of this. We can't change COVID, but we can actually change our experience of it, even by how we speak to ourselves about it. And that's all about how you manage your emotions better, which I'll be sharing with you. Okay, so let's have a look at this. Is change like this? It looks very complicated. That kind of where do you start? It's a clockwork. It just looks like unnatural. And there's lots of change consultants out there who want us to view change like this, because it's kind of reassuring. They can swoop in and kind of, as if there's a manual, they understand everything behind this. And that's reassuring, but it's unlikely to be actually how we experience change, because this is the thing, change is happening all the time. So the useful way to approach it is to notice the useful change you want and to amplify it, rather than feeling it's, we need to get the consultants in, there's some very complex thing here, we wouldn't understand it. And you know what happens when they come in, they kind of get stuck, they build a moat around us, and we kind of become dependent on them. But there's no manual. It'd be great if there was. There's no one person who feels or has the same emotions all the time as each other. So there's no playbook to this. There's not as if there's a playbook. So this isn't actually how change happens. It's actually not that complicated. Also, it's not that we have no experience of it, and we all experience it differently. It's more likely that we are living more like this, which is we're coming down a rapid. A lot of it is out of our control, but we can learn to pivot, adapt a little bit, pick up a paddle, a helmet, etc. That's more likely to be the reality, rather than this kind of fixed mindset. It's very difficult, it's very complicated, you wouldn't understand it. A lot of change, a lot of emotions, a lot of everything is out of our control. So how do you then ride that wave? And how you do that is about how you manage your emotions to be able to do that. If you're instilling yourself with negative emotion and doubt and fear, you're much more likely to be on the previous slide with the clockwork mindset. So we're going to look at how to actually take that rapid, to take that approach. And I'm going to give you a framework whereby after we've had a chat today, you'll actually be able to start this going. Now, there's even an interesting thing with emotional intelligence, because even discussing it, even watching this webinar, you'll actually start to enhance it, which is kind of odd. How does that happen? Because you start to become more aware. And we'll be looking at it, because the reason emotional intelligence can become your superpower, it's because it's all developmental. We all know people that are naturally strong in this space. However, we can all get better at it. And that's why there's business psychology in organizations. So culture. Too many organizations and teams leave building culture to chance. They don't look at how to manage their emotions. They don't look at what good leadership looks like, how we can create a growth mindset in our organizations for innovation and creativity. They just hope one emerges, but the great ones go after it deliberately. So you deliberately create the culture you want. And often you don't notice the culture you're in. They say fish can't see water, but if very nature you're in it, you're not noticing it. That's why when you go on holidays, do you remember you used to go on holidays? And everything feels very alert, greater granularity. Why? Because it's all new. But then very quickly, after a few months, you wouldn't notice it either. And that's a good definition of way to view culture. Now, when we talk about emotional intelligence, it's also good to have a shared framework for that, because it's very popular now, because all the research shows how important it is, especially the more senior you get in an organization. However, there's lots of misunderstanding of what it actually is. So I'd love at the end of our chat today that we have a shared understanding that when we're talking about emotional intelligence, we're talking about the same thing. Lots of people come to business psychologists and coaches now, and when you ask them the kind of set up question, which would be, what would you like from our time together? A lot of them will now say, I need to manage my emotions better. I need better emotional intelligence. And then when you go, that's great. How would you know that you developed your emotional intelligence? And they often go, look, to be honest with you, I don't even know what it is. I've just been told I need it. So it's been bandied around a lot, as in you're being told you need it, but what the hell is it? So we need to look at a shared framework of that, because if we look at anything from leadership to trust to decision-making to influence, we all have different definitions of these things. And this is where conflict happens, is because we have a misunderstanding of what we're talking about. I mean, most conflict is a misunderstanding of somebody else's intent. And this is happening more and more, especially even with COVID. It's a perfect example of it. Some people are very fearful of it. Other people couldn't care less. And there are just two different personality types in terms of your risk tolerance. Neither is wrong or right per se. It's just a different way of viewing it. Now, we can bounce up, have these different personality types of risk tolerance. But when COVID happens, all of a sudden, these differences become big issues. So that's what we have to look at. We need to get a shared understanding. And when you understand how somebody views something, that alone can be enough for you to actually feel a bit relieved. They're not annoying you as much. But it's when they're driving you demented is because you can't understand how they're viewing it like that. So even being aware that we all view things differently, we sense things differently, and we have different emotions and experiences is powerful. Now, one big thing that's happening around here at the moment is all the parent-teacher meetings. Some of you might have been brought into them. I have a little girl. I was just on a session with a parent-teacher session, which are now Zoom because we're not allowed in. But my little girl was being told, or the teacher was saying to us that she can be, can she be quite bossy, Now she's only 11. And I was delighted that the teacher actually noticed this. I said, who are you telling? Come into my house. She bosses me around the place. Now, my wife, who's a little bit more loyal and maybe more of a feminist, said to the teacher, that's interesting that you describe her as bossy, because if she was a boy, would it be more leadership? So again, just a fun way of sharing different ways of viewing something. So that's why we need to get a shared understanding of the construct of emotional intelligence. So let me share that with you. But before I do that, I'll just share a little picture of my girl there. This is down in the 40-foot in Dunleary, Sandy Cove in Dublin. After school, jumping into the water. Leadership or bossy, not quite sure. There she is there again. Okay, so this could be very relevant to any of the parents out there undergoing the parent-teacher meetings at the moment. But let's do this. This is why I'm sharing this with you. This is emotional intelligence. This framework, there's many frameworks. This is considered the scientifically most validated one. So when psychologists who care about this more than others, we look at the psychometric properties in terms of reliability and validity studies, and this is the scientifically most validated model. Now, it's not the only one to work with, but when you're working with something, if you have a shared framework, whether it's around influence or change, whatever it is, but then you're talking about the same thing. Like a fun exercise to do with your team is even to draw up a word like trust or influence, and you get everybody to write down as many definitions as they have for that word. And it could be any word. It could actually be the topic of your meeting. And then when you ask them to pair up with the person beside them, very rarely will they have all the same definitions written down. Even though we're here to discuss this thing. And this is where we get mixed up. And this is where, we thought we were talking about the same thing. People go, okay, Alan, I would need a lot stronger decision-making from you. We need to cut out and we all walk away nodding our heads, but we're actually all, a lot of the time, have different definitions and takeaways of it. So that's why it's important to have a shared understanding. Okay, so this is the work of an Israeli-American psychologist called Reuven Bar-On, who was actually in the early 80s. He was working on items that measured attention deficit disorder. An interesting thing about that now is the majority of items that he identified then, we'd have to change now, or we'd fall into the normal distribution curve of having attention deficit. People can't stay focused long enough on anything. It's dramatically changed over since the 80s, which we'll actually look at shortly as well. But it was Reuven Barron who was studying items to measure attention deficit disorder, when he said, you know what? Never in psychology have we identified items for well-being. It's always been for negative things. We never look at how to measure well-being. So that was his quest. He started to look at measuring well-being. And then we had a Gardner looking at multiple intelligences, realized there's many forms of intelligence. In school, they reward you for academic IQ. However, it's not a great predictor of success in the workplace. Your IQ kind of gets you in. However, to be successful, what he identified was emotional intelligence, how you use that IQ. Now, it's not saying, because Daniel Goleman, who popularized it, he was a New York Times science journalist who wrote a book saying why it can matter more than IQ. People run away with it then and go, God, your IQ, it's not important, it's your EQ. Well, that's not quite the case. Your IQ is very important. However, if you want to utilize it, if you want to have an impact with it, you have to look at the emotional intelligence. So there's an interplay between the two of them. But in school, you'd be made to feel, unless you had academic intelligence, that you're not intelligent, rather than seeing that there's many forms of intelligence, okay? So this is the EQ space. Now, the difference in IQ and personality, psychologists generally, up until 10, 15 years ago, would just measure your IQ or your personality and give you feedback in each. Your personality doesn't really change. Now, there's a nature and nurture debate in that, but it just by a couple of percentage over your lifetime, you're not really, and you shouldn't be looking to change your personality, just to use it more. And your IQ, your intellectual horsepower, stays the same from when you're 6 to 67. And then it drops off a little bit. So if you're doing an IQ result with a psychologist and you didn't like what you were seeing, generally they would say to you, well, just have an awareness around it, which mightn't be that helpful. Now, the EQ space, which is a wonderful area to work in for many reasons. First of all, because it's predictive of how well you'll enjoy your life, and also predictive of how successful you'll be. And how do you measure success in terms of well-being and contentment, etc. However, it's developmental. It's linked in neuroplasticity parts of the brain. Anybody can get better at emotional intelligence. Now, it used to be seen as the person who just had a certain way with them, or the X factor. And we kind of go, oh, that person's just, really good at things, which is great. However, now we understand what that person was doing. They were managing their emotions better. So they had a higher development of emotional intelligence. But the great thing is anybody can do it. Anybody can learn to become more emotionally intelligent. And if you look at sports leadership, we often have IQ and talent, okay? Or sorry, not IQ and talent, it would be talent and practice. So your talent would be kind of how good you are, that's your IQ. The practice would be how much you deliberately go after that. However, to be at your ideal performance state, there's a variable there, which is around how you leverage your emotional intelligence. So you can have great talent, you can have great deliberate practice, but if you're not managing your emotions well, you're unlikely to perform at your optimal state. Now, we all know athletes who don't manage their, and great coaches, that's what they do. They try and get them to learn how to manage their emotions well, not to make them different people, just so they can go out and play to their ability. So on that, I want you to take away that in the terms of the British Psychological Society, we look at IQ, we look at personality, and emotional intelligence now is accepted as its own construct. The difference being anybody can develop it. So here are the 5 areas, which are self-perception, that's knowing yourself. Okay, so there's just 5 areas with 3 factors underneath each. Self-expression would be your communication of those emotions. So these first 2 are very personal. They're kind of intrapersonal, what's happened for you under the bonnet. And then it moves to the more obvious one, where most companies start with, which is the interpersonal, how good you are at connecting with other people. Okay, so we kind of have knowing yourself, and then your ability to connect with other people. And then decision-making. Now, this isn't your aptitude for decision-making. This is how you manage your emotions during the decision-making process. Because a lot of engineers can take an assessment around this and they don't score great in decision-making. But then they kind of go, look, that's what I do for a job. But it's not your aptitude. It's how you handle your emotions during that. And then the 5th one there, stress management. And this is what most people associate people who are emotionally intelligent, that they're better able to flex, adapt, and handle stressful situations. Now, there's 5 areas there with 3 factors underneath each, which could seem, oh God, there's a lot to do. However, the really nice thing about the emotional intelligence is they all interact and interplay with each other. So what I really mean is when we go through this now, even by looking at 1 or 2 areas, like a spider's web, it pulls up all the other areas. So you don't have to go after 15 areas. In fact, even going after 1 area will illuminate and pull up the rest. Okay, so let's look at this together. The first one then is around self-perception. Now, what they've identified, and very much under the bonnet, and most people skip this. Most people, and the kind of NLP and all of that stuff, which is, it has its place, but where psychologists poo-poo it, that's all about faking it and, being good with other people. However, if you don't have strong roots and values, this is very Joe Schmidt, if you don't know what you stand for, well, then it's kind of not very good to be good with other people. You need to be better with yourself and then shift in to using all those other techniques. So this very much starts under the bonnet. And anytime we're asked to work with a sports team, it's generally because it's in the space of what's happening for the athlete in the intrapersonal space. It's something the coach can't necessarily observe or identify, but they know there's something wrong with them. And underneath self-perception, we have areas of self-regard. So your ability to, keep up good self-efficacy, confidence, being aware of your weaknesses, but be very able to leverage your strengths. And then they look at the area of self-actualization. Self-actualization, it's all around purpose and meaning. And that's one of the biggest motivators for people. If you take money off the table, okay, so you'll often hear it bandied around, money doesn't motivate people. That is not the whole picture. Because if you met a homeless guy in the street and I would give you money, but it won't make you more engaged, or even in organizations, it's not true. But what the research does say, if you perceive yourself to be paid fairly, as in I get paid fairly for what I do, and I'm also not envious of other people's pay, well, then more money might give more purpose and engagement. It's off the table. The 3 things, and this is the work of a guy called Dan Pink, you might be familiar with, the 3 things that motivate knowledge age workers, by the way. We're not talking about production line, industrial age control and command. Knowledge age workers, all of us who work with knowledge for business. The 3 things that motivate us most are autonomy. Okay, so your ability, you don't feel you're being micromanaged. And again, it helps the self-regard. Mastery, does my job allow me to get better at stuff? Or am I just going through the motions every day? And the last one, and probably most important one, is purpose. Do I feel self-actualized? Is there a sense of what am I doing this for? Now, this is a really interesting space because it's been identified as, during COVID, people have found work and life less purposeful. And then you'll hear often about the great resignation in this space. However, it doesn't mean that people have gone to mental ill health. Okay, people often, it's a big variance. You don't feel purposeful, so you feel ill health mentally. However, there's a middle space they've identified, which is languishing. We're all languishing. You're not finding everything purposeful, but we're not on the lower end either. So this is a great opportunity to really drive yourself and your people to the purpose bit again. So the languishing, obviously, if left there long enough, you will slip down. So how do we make stuff more purposeful? How do we get people more engaged? And that's all around the self-actualization. And a great man in this space, way before any of this research, was a guy called Viktor Frankl. He wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, what's amazing about him was he was basically in a living experiment. We've done the research on it afterwards, but he was a Jewish psychiatrist in Auschwitz during the Second World War. Now, luckily he got out because he wrote the book in 1946, but he noticed that any of his colleagues or family or friends who gave up any sense of hope or purpose were a lot quicker to die. Now, there's no judgment, obviously they're being experimented on, they're being humiliated, they're being tortured, they're being starved, horrendous conditions. But he identified if you could find some sense of purpose and meaning, even in the horrors of a death camp, you are much more likely to survive. Now, he himself visualized himself lecturing to his psychology students about this, about how having a sense of purpose and meaning, self-actualization could drive you through the horrors of your life. He wrote that in 46, but actually even after the banking crisis, 2007, 2008, Harvard Business Review did a big thing in his work again. And it was big in the banks because you can't give promotions, you can't give money, but if you can tap into that sense of purpose and meaning. So this is a great thing to do for yourself. So what is your purpose and meaning? If there was a business book in the airport for sale and it was about you, what would the title be? Who would endorse it? And what would you write about your success? So it's even getting your contribution out of your head, written down. What would you like your legacy to be? And that is a great way to find stuff more meaningful. And then the last one here then is emotional self-awareness, which again encapsulates everything. Change happens where the awareness is. That's Carl Rogers. So first of all, we have to be aware. Do you remember the old school thing would be, we don't bring emotions to the workplace. They stay at home. The old kind of stiff upper lip. We don't bring emotions in here. You're getting very emotional. Well, you can't actually do that because your emotions are part of you. They come with you. And by pretending you're doing that, you can't actually even use them in a skillful way. This isn't trying to get rid of emotions. It's trying to use them in a way that actually can allow you to feel better and have them as a superpower. So the emotional self-awareness is key to everything. So underneath then self-perception, are you noticing what you're good at? Are you tapping into stuff you find purposeful? Are you even aware of how you're feeling in a situation? And a great way to do this with the self-regard especially is to be aware of flow moments. Now, flow moments are something that often happens when you're engaged in something where you feel alive and you're really tapping into the best things. Now, there's a guy called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He's a big positive psychologist. Sadly, he's a huge guy in our world. He died last week. So if you go into New York Times, there's huge obituaries. But what he did, he was able to identify that people's true strengths lie within their flow moments. And this is one for yourself. Think about it. Most people aren't aware of what their strengths are. They assume it's what they're good at, but they're actually your competencies. It's only actually a strength for you if you're good at it, competency, but also it makes you feel good. Now, how do you know that? Well, these are the flow moments. And a flow moment would be when you're engaged in something where you just feel alive. You feel like, this is what I was born to do. I'm delighted to do this. Now, you can kind of feel tired after it, but it's a nice kind of tired because you really felt that, this was something that made me feel engaged. Now, for this to happen, and this is all the work of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, you have to have the right level of challenge by the right level of skill. And you can even draw this out for yourself and your team. If the challenge is too much, you're unlikely to be in those flow moments. Why? Because you feel anxious, your amygdala, the emotional part of your brain will go off, and you feel, that you feel doubtful. You're not going to be able to be creative and innovative. However, if you have too much skill for what you're doing, it leads to boredom, and you're unlikely to be in those flow either. And again, boredom at the extreme anyway leads to anxiety. So you need to create conditions where everybody feels that, they can play to their strengths, not just what they're good at, but what makes them feel good. And I can work in a control and command environment where I have a lot of anxiety and doubt. However, it's just not good work. And you'll often get old school leaders and managers who feel they're great. They'll say, I get stuff done around here. Well, what kind of stuff? So you need to create an environment where people are even open to talk about this. And for yourself, when do you notice you're in the flow? Now, there's also stuff that makes you feel good, but you're not any good at. Okay, they're not real strengths though. They're probably more hobbies, like singing in the shower. Feels great, sounds terrible. That's okay too. But if you stand back, because often when I'm working with senior leaders and I say to them, what would you like to get from our time together? They'll go, look, I don't need to unpack work because I'm one of the lucky people. I actually get to play to my strengths every day. And when you inquire a little with them, how do you know you're playing to your strengths every day? And they go, well, I've always been told that. Well, and that's a key indicator for me because nobody can tell you how you feel. What they're noticing is something you're good at, but you're the only person who knows how you felt doing it. So, and it's well-intentioned, but you need to stand back from these kind of, conditioning of what our strengths are and actually even look at your diary for the week. And when we actually engage in stuff that you're good at and make you feel good. And the more you do that, the more you notice them, the more you can actually create more of them. And then a lot of people that will be critical of this and go, look, we're not elite athletes. I work in the bank for God's sake, or whatever it is. However, you're much more likely to have a flow moment in work than you are ever in sport. However, the difference is you're less likely to notice it. The only difference in great coaches, etc., is that they're fascinated about the conditions that create flow moments for the people so they can help create them again. And a great way to even start this would be to actually identify, keep a journal, and just jot down when you've had a flow moment. Because invariably, if you're feeling negative emotion and you're on the bus or on the way home, or you've been on Zoom too long, you're not thinking about what went well. You're thinking about, oh, I ended that too quickly. I didn't. So you're actually becoming an expert on everything that takes you out of the flow. But the more you start to notice it, your brain then will be kind of like a habit. It's like a muscle. It's much more likely to be pulled towards those flow moments. So if your self-regard is something that's taking a bashing, which all of ours have, start to notice those flow moments. I mean, it's kind of funny because Deloitte released their research there to say 2 out of 6 people during the pandemic have experienced stress. 2 out of 6. Obviously, it's not. It's 6 out of 6. So what's happening? Is it the questionnaire? Is it what? Well, actually, interestingly, most people don't realize how stressed they were until after the event. So when you ask somebody, are you stressed? They go, no, I'm fine. It's only afterwards you realize, Jesus, that was a harrowing experience. You're just trying to push through it. But a great way to start doing this is notice when you're in the flow. Keep a journal. If your self-regard is low, keep a journal each evening about what went well. Positive psychology is not about ignoring the problems. It's actually quite problem-centric, but it's just more about what we're going to do about them. Now, I'm not ignoring negative emotions, neither trying to get rid of negative emotions, but start to notice more positive ones so you can have more of them. Yeah, and that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to balance it up a bit. So that's a great way to start with the self-regard. Now, underneath there as well, self-regard. So if that's something you and it's a personal thing, keep that journal. If self-actualization is one, if you don't find stuff purposeful, do that idea about, Gestalt therapy used to say, when you're dead, who would you like to see at your funeral? Stephen Covey, who wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, talked about at your 80th birthday, who would you like to see there, and what would they be saying about you? And the other one, I often think about is like, what is your legacy? What contribution do you want to make? How would you know you'd had purposeful life? Because most people sleepwalk through life, and it's only near the end we go, Jesus, how do I make this more purposeful? And that is my guess of why this great resignation is happening. And not that it's going to let people will resign, but the idea that I'd like to, because we took our foot off the treadmill of life and we actually went, what am I doing? Because you would just sleepwalk through life and then we die. There's a great palliative care nurse in Australia who did research in this, and she was studying people in nursing homes about to die, asking them, what are your biggest regrets in life? And the number one biggest regret of people who are about to leave this planet was, if I could live my life again, I wouldn't care what other people thought so much. I'd have led a more purposeful life. Because we sleepwalk. So again, emotionally intelligent people, they're not necessarily doing anything different, but they're very aware of their experience and they're making sure that it's purposeful for them, not somebody else. So again, you can see how they're all linked. You have to be very aware and use your emotional self-awareness and your strengths to see what would make your life purposeful. Now, when you have that, and it's still intrapersonal, your self-expression, that's your emotional expression of this. So most people never communicate what it is they're trying to do. And you should, even hearing yourself say things out loud, it makes sense of how you're thinking. That sounds strange, but it's actually what happens when you're coaching or even counseling with people. When people hear themselves say out loud the answers to these kind of questions, which are kind of weird questions, what would make your life more purposeful? They actually make sense of their thinking. So again, in family therapy, where I came from, we used to say at the end, is there any interventions that could work? However, the difference being that the conversations are the actual intervention. So even asking yourself, coach yourself, what would make this more purposeful, but say it out loud, declare your intent. Because it's a bit like if you're going to do a marathon or you're going to do anything, the minute you say it out loud, it's much more likely it will happen. But people don't do that. They keep it as their own little secret and hopefully it will emerge. Get it out there and it's much more likely to happen. So what's in here is around emotional expression. Emotional expression is the way you communicate, and it's not just, content. It's very little of what you're communicating. It's really around how you say it, your intonation, your emotional expression, and if you're high in emotional expression, people will trust you because you're declaring your intent. They know what you stand for. Because here's an interesting one. In psychology, you might have heard of the idea of learned helplessness. This was identified by who's now considered the father of positive psychology, a man called Martin Seligman. He was the president of the American Psychological Association in '89, and whoever has that tenure very much influences psychology. He put positive psychology on the map. And another interesting little fact, the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin have opened up the first positive psychology health wing in Europe, so helping people get over serious illness. Now, he was meant to be over, but he came over via Zoom. He would be good friends with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, good age himself. But what's really interesting was he started his research in learned helplessness. Why do some kids appear to fall behind? And the thinking was they're given cues by the teacher that we don't believe you really can do this, and they just, they lose their ability. They tune out and they just slip behind. Learned helplessness. Now, like all the studies back then, do you remember? Kind of needed somebody to blame, so we blamed the teachers or the parents. However, he was saying in his swan song now, his biggest learning in psychology and insight is that it was never learned helplessness. Like, they didn't learn it, we didn't condition people to do it. It was actually default. Our brains default to it. So we can't blame anybody. Though it's just we naturally default, and maybe it's a survival mechanism to notice the negative emotions, be fearful. However, if you want to flourish and feel good and have a life built in contentment, you have to be deliberate about the opposite. And that's what he would be saying. You have to express what you want in a deliberate way rather than just sit back and learn helplessness. And in the workplace, then it's all about declaring your intent. And assertiveness, by the way, this is a bit different than the big factor 5 personality. This is how you emotionally assert how you're feeling. So it's using rich emotional vocabulary. Because what will be interesting to you guys is people generally don't remember what you talk about. When you leave a meeting and you go, did you enjoy talking to Sarah? Yeah, it was great. Got a lot from that. What did you get from it? Generally, people are very vague on what they took from a meeting. What they're actually talking about is what they remember. So people remember how you made them feel rather than actually what you're talking about. So it's really interesting space. How you made me feel rather than what we're actually talking about. Okay, so flying along here. So I have a little slide here which says, your team does not have an inherent right to exist. And what you should be thinking about here as well, when we're talking about emotional expression, how do we influence people? If people were talking about a team, what would they be saying? So you get it out of allowing people to talk about your team. You build your brand for yourself and you, because if you're not easy to read, if you don't declare your intent, people slip into learned helplessness. They always read into the negative. So if we're sitting in a meeting or even at home with the kids and you can't pick up, and I'm more senior to you or vice versa, and you can't pick up how somebody else is feeling, they'll always read into it in the negative. You could be thinking about your next meeting or going to the shops, but when you leave, I'll be thinking, she didn't like that. Because we do that, we deliberately, not intentionally, but it's just a natural way we read into the negative. So what do we do then? Well, declare your intent, express and use a rich emotional vocabulary, because people, again, don't remember what you talk about. They're not really going to remember the spreadsheet, but they will remember the emotion. They remember how you made them feel. And this is how to do that properly. Okay. A little article I wrote, I lectured in the IMI around building resilience through purpose-led leadership. So you're more resilient if you're kind of connecting into that independence, what good looks like. And if you want to, I'll send it on to you as well, but it's kind of just a summary of the self-expression composite we're looking at. Okay, so we have the two first areas, which are really around, as I was saying, intrapersonal, what's happening for you under the bonnet, and quite personal as well. Do you build good self-efficacy? Are you doing stuff you find purposeful? Are you aware of your emotions? And once you're aware of them, you can manage them, you can use them skillfully. And then it's about how you make people feel. And that's about declaring your intent, using a way to influence in a positive way. Don't allow people to read into, because people will always read into negative intent. So don't allow the gossip that happens. Get in front of it, get in front of the communication. Be assertive in a useful way that brings people with you independence. Now, those two areas are quite strange. The next one is more obvious. It's the interpersonal. And it's how you connect with other people and build relationships. Now, there's interpersonal relationships there, being comfortable with people, building an emotional bank account, taking the time to listen. And this is huge. And you see this, I think, with Nadella, even in Microsoft, CEO in Microsoft. He was talking about there was quite a fearful culture back in the day in Microsoft. You wouldn't speak up unless you could actually stand over everything you were talking about. There was a robustness to the debate. Now, that was great in the beginning days, but actually what happened is then it limited people's contribution and comfort actually speaking up to great innovative ideas. So it was a fixed mindset. It didn't allow people to actually throw something out there. So Nadella's been going, and he's some great podcasts on us as well, but he said it's all about creating empathy. And he said one of the key things out of the pandemic is creating empathy. So if you want to get hybrid right, he said, put individual concerns first and get everybody to download their their working preferences and understand them. Now, empathy, by the way, is not sympathy. Empathic connection means you're able to listen and understand where somebody else is coming from. You can completely disagree with somebody and have an empathic connection with them. You're just listening to them. I'll give you an example. My little girl comes in from the playground and she has a big problem. She's only 11. She goes, Dad, Barbara was pulling my hair. Now, what you do as a dad, an empathic connection, well, no, you probably go into the kind of fix it mode where you go, well, you know what you do next time that happens. And you give advice, or even worse, you give an autobiographical response and say, well, you know what I did when I was your age, and that used to happen. And you create more chaos and the amygdala, the emotional, and you're feeding the negative emotion, whereby the child just needed to be listened to, just needed the psychological air. So I actually said, Jesus, that must be quite frustrating when that happens. She'll go, yeah, it is. And she'll bounce off. And she'll be much more likely to tell me about the next thing because I've empathically connected with her. They didn't need you to fix things. They just needed a space to have the psychological air so they can manage emotions. So they're not going to come to you if every time they come to you, it's a big fix-it job. So that's why empathy is so important. And it's in the workplace as well. One of the biggest things, it used to be seen as sympathy, but if you can empathically connect, you don't even have to agree with the person. You can completely disagree with them. But if you've shown empathy, they're much more likely to come with you, disagree and commit. And then social responsibility is huge now. And actually Glassdoor, the recruitment people, or they show what people think of companies, etc. But one of the biggest shifts in younger people looking to join companies now is they want to work for somewhere that they know is socially responsible. And also the behaviors of the senior leadership team, what's going on there. There was nowhere even on our maps when we were their age, even being aware that I want to work for something that I can actually be proud of. And that's becoming bigger during the Great Resignation as well. Again, that's how you share the purpose and social responsibility bit. Google, who are great at sharing what they do well, did a great study called Project Aristotle, which was kind of looking at what do our best teams do differently. And what they noticed were that the best teams, they followed them around for over a year, and they were kind of saying, and they're all engineers, right? Is it when you have kind of strong introverts mixed up with extroverts, personality types didn't make a difference? Is it when you had a strong leader at the top of the table giving out KPIs, didn't make a difference? So what they noticed were the best teams are the ones that actually created their own norms and ways of working. And not the ones that were handed down to them necessarily. And you can Google this and you'll get the study, but actually the teams that took their time to work out their own ways of working with each other. So not, going on around, we know what we have to achieve, but how are we going to, what are our norms and behaviors as a team? And the two norms that work best, the first one was there was an equality in distribution of conversational turn taking. And what that meant was, not intentionally, but when they measured it at the end of the year, most people spoke a similar length of time. And the other one they noticed was there was social sensitivity. So whereby if one person wasn't feeling great, they could notice the energy was down. They didn't just move on. They picked up on each other's moods. So those things, psychologists love constructs, but it fits nicely into the construct of psychological safety. So the best teams had created psychological safety, and that was the most important thing, which again is a set of trust building behaviors. How you speak to yourself, even being aware on others, is so important. I like this one from Michael Lewis. He did Moneyball. He wrote a book on Trump. Who hasn't? But he said, when you told people that they had a 90% chance of surviving surgery, 82% of patients opted for the surgery. But when you told them that they had a 10% chance of dying from the surgery, which is, of course, just a different way of putting the same odds, only 54% chose the surgery. So it just shows you how important your words are. In fact, they're talking about now in the States that there's people suffering from mental health issues after recovering from COVID. So we're going, God, not only do we have COVID, but now when you recover from it, you might have a mental health issue. Well, it's unlikely, well, we don't know, but the links are not that strong. It's more likely that it's post-COVID stress. And it's really the way we've been thinking about it, speaking about it, putting it on the radio, that when you actually catch it, you get so overwhelmed that that's what's causing the ill health when you recover from it, rather than the actual illness itself. So it just shows you how important the way you speak can transform your experience of things. Now, just mindful of time. So we've 5 areas to look at. The first 2 are really about you. The next one is around how do you listen, create psychological safety, share your social responsibility, link it to your purpose. That's all the important bits. And that's psychological safety right there. And it also enables people to feel that they can contribute without feeling stupid, the growth mindset, share ideas that they might know. And also to be vulnerable, because being vulnerable though with skill, fessing up when they think something won't actually work. Now, decision-making is huge. And if you're familiar with a great psychologist called Daniel Kahneman, he wrote the book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. He's just collaborated on the latest body of research called Noise. And he was even showing that how you're managing your mood can impact decision-making, but also the error of judgment, even between, not bias, which was his first book, but error of judgment between the same person making the same decision, but depending how they were feeling, could have a huge impact. Loads of case studies in his book around even judges before or after lunch. Your pro could be stronger or less, but it's really about how you manage your emotions. There's error of judgment and the noise in the system, and it's phenomenal and exists in all companies. And what's interesting as well in his research, anybody who reads it, they go, absolutely. But the reason they accept it so willingly, he would say, is because they all assume that it's other people making these errors. It's a bit like driving. Everybody else is a bad driver. I'm okay. But the reality is we're all doing it. So what's in here is problem solving. Can you emotionally problem solve to bring people with you? Reality testing. Are you clear on what's most important, or are you just going after everything? Or Stephen Covey would say, my big rocks. And then where a lot of this space starts was around impulse control. Do you have the ability to delay, or do you just jump into everything? Well, a huge one now, and this is the paradox of choice. There's so much people, the idea of Zoom fatigue. Everybody, we taught Zoom fatigue when the concept came out at the beginning. It was just one of these pop psychology things. But actually it's been proven. Stanford did a big peer review paper. We all, even from this webinar, have a strong sense of Zoom fatigue. And a lot of it is coming from actually, you have to do a constant gaze at the screen. Whereby if we're in a conversation in a room, we don't constantly look at each other in the eyes. And it's just so much technology coming after us, whereby it was meant to free us up, but it's actually paralyzing us. And the other one is that the majority of you right now are multitasking. You're doing something else. You're writing an email, you're getting a kid back from school, you're doing something. I'm not judging it, by the way. We're just showing, but that's what happens on this. That's part of the Zoom fatigue. We all multitask. So how can you feel so engaged with your team, etc.? Loads of little things you say, not every call has to be on video. If you find somebody very difficult, by the way, don't have them so big on your screen. If you have to have a difficult conversation, make them smaller. So lots of little hacks around the Zoom fatigue. Okay, so now what I want to share with you now, and this is, if you're interested in that space, it's Daniel Kahneman's book is amazing. It's Noticing Progress. And the reason I mentioned this around decision making is progress will always happen, but people don't notice it, which is really interesting. Like when I'm coaching somebody and they give me their goals and they get them, when I meet them a year later, I'll say, how is everything going? Not great. And it's a default. Remember Martin Seligman's research was a default. Now, when we go back and actually look at what they were trying to achieve, quite often they go, oh yeah, no, I got all that. So you need to become like a resource, a progress detective. So rather than keep telling your team, especially during the pandemic, what we still have to do, don't forget to notice the progress and what's been achieved. Celebrate success and bring it with you. That's one of the best ways to manage your emotions, because you'll instill positive emotions and you're much more likely to move on to the tricky things in a more positive way. So notice progress and also keep score. Most people don't notice progress because they're not noticing the movement. But the minute, if we're playing a game of tennis together, we'll have a nice knock around. But the minute the scoreboard goes up, it's a completely different game. And that's why Gallup research has shown that most people in organizations don't know what they do every day makes a difference, because they're not keeping score. So of course they're going to be disengaged. And the last one, because I want to create time for questions if there is any. Psychological safety. Yes, so psychological safety, which I mentioned that Google had identified, without accountability, we're all just nice to each other. You're in your comfort zone. However, what you find a lot in organizations around the fixed mindset, that kind of clockwork I showed you at the beginning, with accountability, whereby you're held accountable, but I don't feel safe to actually speak my mind or be vulnerable. Well, I won't speak up. Why would I? It's control and command. So what we're looking for in an emotionally intelligent way is psychological safety and the accountability. That's the learning zone. And that's where you can have robust, productive conflict. That's why emotionally intelligent people go for each other, because they feel they have that emotional bank account with each other to be allowed to challenge each other. And accountability is the glue. Most people don't hold themselves accountable. And that's what John Cotter would say, most change falls apart. Not because people don't know what to do, but we don't hold ourselves accountable. And that's why, even Weight Watchers or Alcoholics Anonymous, all of these great support groups, they're just there to help you with the accountability. It's not rocket science what most people want to do. Most people know what they want to do differently, but they fail in the accountability of it. Okay. And then last, what most people associate with emotionally intelligent people, they're really good at stress management. They're able to flex, they're able to adapt, they can handle stressful situations, they're optimistic. And also with the optimism is a way of viewing. It's not ignoring problems, but optimistic people see things differently in three ways. This is according to Martin Seligman. When something bad happens, they see it as less permanent, less severe, and less personal. Where a more pessimistic person, they're catastrophizing, they think it's going to last longer and it's overwhelming. Both of those are habits. So you can learn to be more optimistic by practicing everything we looked at. And in his latest book, Adam Grant, who's a Wharton business psychologist, Think Again, which is kind of the book cover came out the same week that Bill and Melinda Gates split up. But you see there, it said a must read, The Power in Knowing What You Don't Know. So they must have read it and practiced it very much so as well. But think again. And he was really saying his premise in this book, and he's a great psychologist, is the inability to see something from somebody else's perspective or to think again leads to hostility. So it's all about being flexible, all about being empathic, and how is somebody else viewing this? How am I viewing this? So I might be able to do something different. Okay, so just to show you the power of your mindset, this guy, I love this example, Roger Bannister. In 1954, he broke the 4-minute mile. However, at that time, all the medical journals at the time said you can't do it. Your heart will combust, you'll die. He managed to do it. Now, what drove the behavioral scientists mad at the time wasn't so much that he'd done it, but was that, within 18 months, it was also achieved by 39 other runners. Now, they didn't suddenly say, oh, let's go and do it, Bannister's done it. They were trying to do it at the same time, but it just shows your power of your mind, whether you're being pessimistic or optimistic, you're only viewing it very strongly. And as Adam Grant said, that leads to a more hostile version of yourself, the inability to flex and think differently. And then just constantly sharing in teams, but this optimism, high-performing teams share more than 5 times more positive feedback than low-performing teams. You don't have to worry about the negative feedback. We're always given that. We do have to worry about delivering the positive feedback and noticing progress. Okay, so I know we went through that. I just want to keep time for questions. There's 6 minutes, I think. So there's 5 areas identified, 3 factors underneath each. It can seem overwhelming. Don't. Even pick one area, and like a spider's web, you'll develop them all. I'll stop the share just in, let Sarah come in with any questions if there is any.
There is, and thank you so much, Alan. That was amazing. That was brilliant. There's definitely a lot to take away in there. We do have a couple of questions. Just firstly, how do you know what your true purpose or your strengths, etc., are if you're still on the hamster wheel? Is there a test, or do you coach individually?
Well, that's what coaching does. You can just test, there's an emotional intelligence test, but some great questions around that would be, literally, if your career didn't exist, would it be irrelevant? What Stephen Covey, who I'm a big fan of, was answering the question, he would say, work out your values and write a personal mission statement. If you're 6, another one we use is a magic booklet. If there was a booklet in the airport and it was a business book and it was about you, what would your title be? What would you call it? And that would help you start thinking your purpose. And then on the inside, what would you put down as the secret of your success? How did you make it? And then People buy a book based on who's endorsed it. Well, who would endorse your book and what would they be writing about you? That will start to give you telltale signs of your purpose. But standing back now and asking yourself those questions, how would I know in my life I was making a better contribution? Start with your values. So what are your values? And then build it on from there. And also the article I wrote in the IMI, that's kind of, there's lots of questions in there. But there's loads of resources, but it really is about getting time to answer the questions and hearing yourself out loud answering those questions, and your purpose will emerge from that. And actually, the best book, Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, you'll definitely get inspiration from that. And it's very small as well, so it's not a very intimidating book.
Brilliant, thank you. For anyone wondering, we will send out Alan's article as well in the email after this webinar, so you can have a read of that. Just the next question then, it's hard to work in a culture of fear and blame. How can staff deal with this?
Well, that's it. So if you're in the culture of fear, first of all, learning how to manage your emotions as well. But if pointing out to leaders how that environment, that fixed mindset environment where you're in fear, control, and command is damaging performance, damaging creativity. All the research is out there now on fixed mindset, growth mindset. So if you're if I'm doubting myself, it's not as if you have a fixed mindset of a growth one. We all have both. But if there's an environment or a person who triggers my one where I'm doubting myself, I won't perform well. Lots of this was people are getting more paranoid because of Teams and Zoom and all this technology. But a really good one is when you find somebody intimidating, because your amygdala is quite primal, actually gets intimidated. And in fact, you can make them as small as you like. Or even if you find somebody intimidating and you're remote working, do a phone call or go for a walk rather than stare at them. But I suppose one is the education of the leadership team, then look at the impact that's having. But then me personally, there's loads of little things about managing my emotions better. But that's a great little hack about making the person smaller on your screen.
Thank you so much. And then just another question, I've got time for one more. Do you see resilience as part of emotional intelligence? And do you have any tips in terms of building resilience, both personally and workplace?
Yeah, resilience is, everything here we've talked about is resilience, and the stress management bit we just looked at, right? Optimism mindset, stress tolerance, believing you have coping mechanisms, and flexibility. In fact, happiness used to be included in the idea of emotional intelligence. But you can't say somebody's happy because they're emotionally intelligent, because there's a context to it. So you could be in the middle of, Afghanistan now, very emotionally intelligent, just not very happy, but there's a positive correlation. But this is resilience, what we've been looking at. And there's 4 kind of resilience drivers they've identified as: do you physically look after yourself? Do you emotionally connect with others? Do you do stuff you find purposeful? And then you keep yourself mentally alert. And those 4 areas are like 4 legs of a chair. If one of them is out, you would be on balance. You know yourself when you've done a run or walk or meditation or open sea swimming, how you actually feel easier to connect with other people. So the physical exercise, looking after yourself, it's all there. So absolutely, resilience is important, and it's wrapped up in everything we've talked about.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for at the minute. So just really to say, Alan, thank you so much for such a brilliant and thought-provoking presentation. I've definitely taken away loads of information and tips there. As mentioned, everyone, just at the start of the webinar, you will be receiving any slides used throughout this webinar, as well as being able to access this morning's recording on the council's website. Just as well as this, I will be sending around a short feedback survey, which we would really appreciate if you could complete and let us know what you thought of the webinar and what your best takeaway has been from today. All feedback is welcome, both positive and negative, as this will help Council design next year's programme of events. Don't forget to tune in to Council's Facebook page on Monday evening just to see if you are today's daily prize winner. Draws for all 4 days with events this week will be made on Friday. And if you are the lucky recipient of either an iPad or Fitbit, one of the Council's officers will be in contact with you. Lastly, before we go, we have a packed programme of webinars this week. Make sure you check out the programme online and just register for some more of this week's events. They're all free and you can register right up until the start time. So again, on behalf of Mid Ulster District Council, thank you so much for your attendance and your interaction today. I hope we're sending you away with a lot of information to use in your daily business. Thank you everyone, and thank you to Alan, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone. Bye.